Hello, and welcome to our podcast called Families in Extraordinary Times. My name is Erika Kuhlman. I'm a professor at Idaho State University, and at ISU, I teach a class called Families in Former Times, which is a class about how the concept of family and the family itself has changed over the course of many centuries. So just to give you a sense of what the class typically talks about, we start with the concept of a patriarchal family in ancient times when men tended to dominate females in order to protect them and protect their reproductivity for the sake of the species' survival. We then continue on and discuss the medieval period in European history when the concept of family or the word family was actually meant household rather than the kind of mom, dad, and the kids understanding of family that we have today. In the case of the Middle Ages, this was a time in which the lord of the manor tended to require military service from his serfs, and they provided this protection in exchange for housing, and so they were part of the household. From there, we talk about industrialization and how industrialization has changed our understanding of the family. We talk about the rise of the notion of privacy, with homes themselves changing in terms of the numbers of rooms, the bedrooms that are considered to be private, different bedrooms for different members of the household. We talk about the way that industrialization changes gender roles, and women begin to also work for in an economy rather than remain at home. We then also discuss how in former times families were often simply economic relationships or structures. But with the rise of the 20th century, we see more often people joining or forming families for the sake of emotional nurturance and emotional support. So this brings us to today, in which we're experiencing a new phenomenon in our society, namely the rise of a pandemic called the coronavirus. So with students who are with me today, we've been talking about how the coronavirus has been impacting families. And so that's what we're going to discuss today. So let me ask the students to introduce themselves.
I'm Ruth Bates.
Hi, I'm Ashley Crosley.
Tyler Holman.
I'm Jacob Taggart.
And I'm Felicia Thompson, and I'm gonna get us started off on our discussion here today. So just as an overview, kind of what Dr. Kuhlman was talking about, some of the things that we have been focusing on with this pandemic, which has really made all of our lives feel extraordinary right now. These are not normal circumstances, and it brings a lot of change to everyday life. So with the family in this pandemic, some of the things that we've talked about already, just as kind of a broad overview, is ideas of keeping in contact with family, social media and how that could impact the family, big social events that are typical for families like weddings and funerals, not being able to be quite the same as they normally are for our society or our cultures. For me in particular, I wanted to start off by talking about contact with family and kind of doing that through social media. So lots of different ways to do that, through Messenger video, through Zoom, through FaceTime. There's so many things. But something that I've noticed for myself is that I end up being in contact with a lot of members of my family that I'm not normally in contact with. So they actually all live in the same state. I live kind of farther away. It's not that far away, but it feels really far away, especially when I'm by myself for weeks at a time in my apartment, all alone, and they're all together. So it's been interesting to hear from them all even separately and to kind of see how my relationships have strengthened with certain members of my family that weren't necessarily, even in a time when it was easier for me to go and see them. So I wanted to open that up to everybody else and see what your thoughts were on that.
So I was just going to say that for me and my family, since we live only an hour away, I feel like I haven't talked to them as much because I used to visit them all the time and now I'm not able to. So almost like talking to each other is almost painful because we miss each other so much. So I feel like we don't talk as much, but that's probably just my family.
No, I think that's really interesting. And I had the opportunity to actually go visit my family a week ago. And when I got there, it was, so like I said, they've all been together for the last like 3 weeks, just like 4 of them all holed up together, and I've been by myself. But when I came in, they treated me like a celebrity, and I was like, whoa, okay, you guys have been alone for too long. But it was interesting to see that dynamic, and they really just needed like outside social interaction.
That's really great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine that the whole notion of suddenly being thrown in a situation that is pretty emotional after all. I mean, a virus is a frightening thing, and often an emotion like fear will make you want to interact more with family members. But it also might be, provide a different kind of context to interact with people that you don't normally interact with. And so I can imagine it could be kind of awkward.
Definitely. And I know that there's been kind of the opposite issue with people being stuck in the home with people that they're not used to being there with. So were there any more thoughts on that?
So in my family, my sister and her husband, both of their jobs have been closed down. So they've both moved into our house. And it's been kind of interesting. And also me and my other brother have moved home from college. So it's been kind of interesting because I'm sure it throws the whole family dynamic off because my parents have them and their younger children, and now the older children are home, and my sister and her kids are here. So now it's like throwing us all into this multi-generational household where there's a lot of pressure on everyone to financially and emotionally provide support for everyone that they aren't used to providing support for.
Yeah, and I think Tyler really brings up a situation in which a lot of people who are older might remember more than younger people. So in US history, we had the Great Depression, which was quite a traumatic moment in American history when we had the same thing kind of happening. People were thrown out of work, there was high levels of unemployment, and often young couples either wouldn't marry because the prospect of the man back then being less often able to provide for a wife might have made him not marry. But we also had people moving in with extended families. And even in the 1970s, during the recession that occurred there, and in that point in history, we saw a lot of extended families kind of reforming. So you're a young adult, you get married perhaps, and you go off to start your new life. And then suddenly a crisis happens, and you find yourself being kind of thrown back in sort of the pot of the extended family. And yeah, it can be very awkward.
So, since I haven't talked much, so the coronavirus has impacted me and my family in ways where I didn't quite expect. Just like the Great Depression, since this coronavirus has impacted everybody, including Governor Bradley's stay-at-home order, along with other state governors around the country, including President Donald Trump's social distancing guidelines. It's been it's just awkward just because because I live in a family where everyone socializes all the time, but since this concerns of being close to people and spreading the virus just because because of our relatives going to work with people who they would normally get a whole contact with on a daily basis. It's just, since I have it's just everybody's been kind of socializing away from each other, and that, especially of me being away from my grandparents, just because they're in a generation where it's just one of those generations where they're at risk because because they're older and that their immune systems are not going to be as good as the generation I'm living in right now. Just it's just it's tough, especially me growing up in the LDS church that where everybody gets to meet with each other and say hello, how things were, and it's just kind of a great way to. The coronavirus did give us a way to be able to talk to our families and be close to our families more. It's like me growing up, doing the sacrament every once a month, and be able to talk about what's been happening in our lives outside of our home, where we're safe away from this deadly virus that's affecting all the older generations.
Yeah, Jacob brings up a really another really interesting point, and that's the idea that we if we think about families, again, we typically think about mom, dad, and the kids. But you bring up the notion of community, and I think that's a really interesting other aspect to talk about. So in the United States, we saw in the 1970s, we saw rising divorce rates. We now have people less often marrying in this country. We have declining birth rates. And I know that in the 1970s, a lot of popular culture began to focus on the workplace as family. So in other words, people began to devote more of their energy in their life to their work, whether it's more of a career or just simply a place where they go every day to make a living. But they wind up creating very family-like relationships with those at work. And
especially with essential workers, just because everybody who works in essential work, or like if you're a firefighter or a paramedic or a grocery worker, especially a customer service rep for like a moving company, especially, it's just they kind of are seen as like these like these big heroes on the front line, even though we don't really wear capes, but it's just everybody tends to show appreciation for how much we sacrifice our lives outside the home to hopefully not get infected by the virus, to try to keep things afloat, especially when everybody's kind of it's this since this idea of the Black Plague affecting where it's like that affecting everybody, and everybody's too afraid to socialize because it's like you get affected by it and you're dead, basically, is how it's kind of been like.
Yeah, I think, when we think about emotional support, I think a lot of us actually get a lot of our emotional support from our colleagues at work. And so we wind up having workplaces that actually function in some ways like families as well. So Ruth, did you have anything you'd like to introduce?
Well, I was just thinking along the lines with work and economics about how with the industrial age going on, how a lot more people became independent, and a lot of times families were formed through love instead of economic security necessity. And how nowadays with how the virus is going on, a lot of people are under quarantine and people can't do their jobs, and how a lot of times it has led to, as they coined it, corona divorce. That a lot of people have been stuck together and a lot of them are divorcing now. And I think a lot of it has to do with how the economic sphere has developed, that family has gone back to get married for economic reasons and security reasons instead of love. And since the economy went back down, like with the Great Depression, people aren't getting married anymore, or they're separating now. And I just think that's a really big impact from the coronavirus issues going on right now.
Anyone else have any thoughts along those lines?
I don't know. For me and my husband, we've only been married for like 3 years, and thankfully we are both essential workers, so we do get to a break from each other at home. But I know my mother and father-in-law are both teachers, and they've been stuck at home, and I think they're both going a little bit crazy being around each other so often and the kids. But I don't think that in their case anything bad is going to happen, but I can see how being stuck at home, especially with kids when you're not used to being in situations like that, can cause you to maybe end up in a situation where you think of divorce.
Yeah, I think, it's probably too soon to kind of speculate on what might happen in our society. I mean, this has been going on since about January or so, but here in Idaho, of course, we're a little behind. So it will be interesting to see what kind of trends we see coming out of this situation, that we can't maybe know precisely how people might respond. But certainly, again, the notion that we've talked about a lot in this class is the notion that, in former times, people often married for economic reasons to sort of marry their fortunes together. Now we kind of have this expectation again of love, that if you're choosing to marry, you're marrying for companionship, you're marrying for love. And so these are things that we find people focusing on as we move into this pandemic. The further along we get into this pandemic, I think the more these kinds of topics will come up in conversation. So I'd like to thank the members of my class here, Ashley, Felicia, Ruth, Tyler, and Jacob. Thank you very much for participating, and we appreciate you tuning into us. And let's hope for better days ahead.
God bless you guys.
Thank you.